Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, stood at the apex of his power in 1812. He had redrawn the map of Europe, his armies triumphant from the shores of Spain to the banks of the Vistula. Yet one adversary remained defiant: Tsar Alexander I of Russia. Their uneasy alliance, forged at Tilsit in 1807, had begun to crumble. Napoleon's continental system, designed to cripple British trade, had hurt the Russian economy. The Tsar's refusal to fully enforce the blockade, coupled with his growing influence in the Balkans, fueled Napoleon's suspicion and ambition. On June 24, 1812, the Grande Armée, a vast force of over 600,000 men, crossed the Niemen River into Russia. This marked the beginning of Napoleon's ambitious campaign, a gamble to crush Russia and solidify his dominance over Europe. Napoleon envisioned a swift and decisive campaign. He aimed to engage and defeat the Russian armies in a major battle, forcing Alexander I to sue for peace. The vastness of Russia, however, would prove to be a more formidable foe than anticipated. Unbeknownst to Napoleon, the Russians had prepared a strategy that would exploit the very scale of their land, a relentless scorched earth policy. As Napoleon advanced deeper into Russia, his supply lines stretched thinner, and his forces began to experience the strain of the campaign. The scorching summer heat baked the land, while the lack of substantial Russian resistance baffled the French. The Russians, adhering to their strategy, retreated eastward, drawing Napoleon further into the vast expanse of their territory. Villages were emptied, crops burned, and wells poisoned, leaving the advancing French forces with a desolate landscape stripped bare of provisions. This scorched earth policy, while devastating for the Russians, aimed to starve and demoralize the invaders, turning the vastness of Russia into a weapon against Napoleon. The scorched earth policy, while strategically sound, inflicted immense suffering on the Russian people. Villages were laid to waste, their inhabitants forced to flee eastward, leaving behind their homes and livelihoods. The burning of Moscow, a city of wooden structures, created a firestorm of unimaginable proportions. The fire raged for days, consuming entire districts and leaving thousands homeless. This act of self-inflicted destruction, while strategically significant, underscored the profound sacrifices made by the Russian people in defense of their homeland. Despite the devastation, the Russian strategy was taking its toll on the French. The Grande Armée, accustomed to living off the land, found itself increasingly starved of supplies. The relentless march, coupled with the lack of provisions, began to weaken the French forces. Desertion rates soared, and morale plummeted as disease and hunger spread through the ranks. The once mighty Grande Armée was slowly being whittled down, not by enemy swords but by the unforgiving vastness of Russia itself. After weeks of pursuit and with the Russian army seemingly cornered, Napoleon finally confronted the Russians at Borodino, a village west of Moscow. On September 7, 1812, one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars commenced. The Battle of Borodino was a brutal, day-long engagement involving nearly 250,000 soldiers. The French, though ultimately victorious, suffered heavy casualties, with estimates reaching over 30,000 men. The Russian army, although battered, was far from destroyed. They had inflicted significant losses on the French and, crucially, preserved their fighting force. The victory at Borodino came at a heavy price for Napoleon, further weakening his army and dimming hopes for a decisive victory. Napoleon's entry into Moscow a week later was a hollow triumph. The city, largely deserted and set ablaze by the retreating Russians, offered no respite for the weary French forces. Instead of the hoped-for surrender, Napoleon found himself trapped in a burning city, his army depleted, and winter approaching. With supplies dwindling and the Russian winter approaching, Napoleon was forced to make a fateful decision retreat from Moscow. On October 19, 1812, the Grande Armée began its long and arduous withdrawal. What followed was one of the most harrowing military retreats in history. The French army, ill-prepared for the harsh Russian winter, faced relentless attacks from Cossacks and Russian troops. The bitter cold, coupled with starvation and disease, decimated the retreating French forces. The once mighty Grande Armée was reduced to a straggling, starving mass. Of the more than 600,000 men who had crossed the Niemen River in June, only a fraction, perhaps as few as 10,000, returned. The disastrous Russian campaign shattered Napoleon's aura of invincibility. It emboldened his enemies and marked a turning point in the Napoleonic Wars. News of the catastrophe spread like wildfire across Europe, galvanizing opposition to French rule. The Russian campaign, Napoleon's gamble for ultimate victory, had instead paved the way for his downfall.